Just imagine being exiled to a 7-acre island for 40 days to live or to die, knowing that almost no one survives. This was the horror that awaited victims of the Bubonic Plague in Venice, Italy, centuries ago, when Venice was the trading capital of Europe, and the Black Death ripped its way across the continent. Poveglia Island is a triangular landmass, one of 166 islands in the South Lagoon between the cities of Venice and Lido. It's called the world's most haunted island, and for good reason. For hundreds of years, it was the dumping ground for hapless victims of diseases beyond the reach of medical help. It was described by the few who survived as hell on earth. Its first inhabitants arrived back in AD 421. They were Romans living in the empire's final decades. Men, women, and children who were fleeing invasions by the Goths and Huns. Its defensible location made it an escape from the barbarian invaders for the next 900 years. For the attacking hordes, the tiny landmass wasn't worth the trouble it would take to conquer. Over the centuries, the inhabitants of Poveglia flourished, insulated from the laws and taxes in force on the mainland. Venice, however, had become a leading economic power, and by the 14th century, it was Europe's most prosperous center of international trade. A fortress was constructed to guard the entranceway to the Venetian lagoon. Enemy ships were fended off or destroyed by the island's powerful defenses, while trading vessels from around the world sailed in with their valuable cargoes and passengers. But nothing could stop a deadly stowaway that would eventually kill a third of Europe, one that would come to be known as the Bubonic Plague. Outbreaks of the disease carried by fleas living on rats occurred numerous times in ancient Greece and Rome, but in the 14th century, ships sailing in from Crimea brought a fresh wave of plague to European shores and produced the deadliest pandemic in history. In 1348, the horrifying disease arrived in Venice and would go on to kill half the population of the city. Painful black pustules appeared on the bodies of the victims, and the disease usually killed within just 3 days. Bodies stacked up so quickly, there were not enough of the living to bury the dead. Smells emanated from houses where corpses lay forgotten. Social norms began to break down, and laws were passed to prevent people from abandoning the city. But when it became clear that even the city's elite were not safe, the idea of a quarantine zone arose. It was the first attempt at a quarantine system to restrict the spread of disease. Poveglia Island was chosen as the site of this new experiment. In 1423, a colony of large communal buildings called lazaretti was built to house plague victims. These quarantine stations were unsanitary and poorly ventilated, in part because doctors at the time had no idea how the disease was spread. To be sent to Poveglia was a virtual death sentence. Boatloads of the ill, including children, were taken there. As many as 160,000 people who became sick and were too weak to resist were forced into a hellish exile. At the island's center was a crematorium that incinerated masses of bodies in giant funeral pyres. Even the bodies of Venetian citizens who died on the mainland were brought to Poveglia for burning. Archaeologists estimate that half the soil on the island today is the ashen remains of cremated victims. Once the epidemic passed, Poveglia was repopulated. Then in 1379, the War of Chioggia broke out, and a new fort was constructed as a defense. Those still living there were evacuated to Venice, and the island became a battlefield. After 3 years of fighting, the residential facilities were completely destroyed, and only a few dozen people were able to return. In 1485, another plague outbreak tore through Venice, and the casualties this time included the Venetian head of state. The quarantine idea was revived, and it spread to other cities, even though it was proven ineffective in heading off the disease. Buildings full of the sick and dying saw patients crammed into rooms that slept 3 or 4 to a bed. The Black Death struck yet again in 1630, this time more fiercely than before. Venetians who exhibited even the slightest of symptoms would be forced, sometimes kicking and screaming, into exile for 40 days. Most of them would never leave the island. Medical science was useless against the pestilence. The main job of a doctor during this time was not to cure the sick, but to keep track of the number of deaths. They performed the occasional autopsy and were sometimes witnesses to a victim's last will and testament. A lot of doctors used this information to steal the property of the deceased. Doctors confronting legions of the deceased began wearing specialized uniforms, the hazmat suit of the day, which were created to prevent them from contracting the infection. It was thought the plague was caused by foul odors, so these uniforms included an odd white mask with a long beak that was filled with perfumes or with spices like mint and clove. A black cloak was intended to protect the doctor's body from contamination, and it was covered in soot to repel bodily fluids. It also included a black hat to indicate the wearer was a doctor. Physicians would also carry a long wooden stick used to examine their patients or to defend themselves against attack. Some patients asked to be whipped with them, believing their sickness was the result of their sins and that a cure would come through painful repentance. Meanwhile, primitive cures included covering the painful buboes with human excrement, or pouring mercury over the victims and sticking them in an oven. In 1777, the Magistrate of Health for Venice made Poveglia into a clearing station to check for plague victims from other countries. The first modern quarantine station was built in 1793, and sailors from around the world had to be inspected on the island before being allowed into Venice itself. With all this notorious history behind it, legends of the place being haunted began to circulate. Poveglia became known as the Island of Ghosts. In the early 1800s, Napoleon Bonaparte used these rumors and the island's defensible location to his advantage by keeping stores of gunpowder and weapons there, a place where no one was likely to go. He also had a 12th century church there destroyed, and its bell tower converted into a lighthouse. When Napoleon's weapon stores were finally discovered, the island was attacked and became the site of numerous battles, which only added to the death toll. A half-century later, the plague was gone, and Poveglia was converted into an asylum for the mentally ill. The conditions were horrific, given that the structures were designed to house the dying rather than to treat the living. An official mental hospital was opened in 1922. The decaying sign at the entrance is still there to this day. By this time, Poveglia's reputation as a zone of death and horror was so firmly established that wild stories about the asylum were frequently told. Patients reported being kept up all night by the terrifying screams of medieval plague victims, whose spirits were said to stalk the grounds. In the 1930s, stories emerged that a doctor in charge of the facility was performing bizarre experiments on his patients, using lobotomies in an attempt to cure their condition. These nightmare procedures were done with hand drills, and remnants of strange mechanical devices still littered the complex. Finally, according to a nurse who claimed to have witnessed the event, the sinister doctor went fully insane and threw himself off of the church's bell tower, though it's not clear if he committed suicide or was pushed. The bell tower has since been removed, but locals claim they can still hear the faint ringing of church chimes. The hospital was officially shut down in 1968, and the island was completely abandoned. But only a few years later, there was an attempt to convert Poveglia into a geriatric center. The experiment failed by 1975. More recently, other efforts to rebuild the hospital were made, but construction suddenly stopped without an official explanation. More rumors spread about dark spirits, scaring away the workers. Since 2014, Venice has tried to sell Poveglia to private owners, but nobody has stepped up to claim the storied property. Today, visitors are completely banned from the island. Its empty structures lay fallow amid heaps of debris, rusting equipment, and rotting furniture. Fishermen steer clear of the site, and water taxis refuse to take passengers there, A handful of investigators had been allowed to explore the ruins, and some of them came back reporting strange odors, or the sound of disembodied screams, mysterious footsteps, or the creepy moans of some unearthly beast. Evil seems to permeate the site, and Poveglia remains a forbidden island to this day. My name is Scott, and thank you so much for watching. We're a group of curious and passionate humans creating documentary-style content for those who share our curiosity, ask questions, and seek to dig deeper in a world where almost everything isn't quite what it seems. We are Mystery Syndicate. If you like what we do, please consider subscribing to our YouTube channel, leave a comment, and give this video a like. And to be notified when we post new videos, hit that notification bell. Also, check us out on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, and for exclusive merchandise, visit our website at www.mysterysyndicate.com. And for those that wish to support our channel, please visit Mystery Syndicate on Patreon. We have a variety of new patron tiers with tons of great benefits. If you want to see your name on a future video, be sure to check it out. From all of us at Mystery Syndicate, thank you again. We sincerely appreciate your support.